welcome to another episode of EK Tries to Film a Video Before It Gets Dark challenge. Hi and welcome to my channel Explain. My name is EK and in this video I want to rate, rank, review, etc. all the historic places that I visited in this year, 2022. When making this list I was surprised at how many places I'd actually been this year, and I came up with a list of 10, some of which I have visited before, I think maybe like 4 or 5. I visited before, but I'm reviewing them anyway, not least because since visiting them I've had a significant systems upgrade and I now use an electric wheelchair. She is called Anna Lynn and I love her dearly. Unfortunately, this update has had the tendency to complicate my enjoyment of most things, but especially historic sites. I appreciate, of course, the necessity of preserving these sites, disturbing them as little as possible and kind of retaining both the character and the raw material of the centuries past. That being said, I do find it kind of a little bit galling when I'm told that no, it's too old for us to put in kind of like a platform lift or a ramp, but that I'm of course welcome to use the cafe or gift shop. It's just so intriguing that the things which will make the site money are considered sufficiently necessary to risk damaging the site, but a small platform lift attached to a staircase would be an act of cultural vandalism. So disability access, or at least how I have experienced it, will be taken into account with all these sites, as well as kind of how the site engages with its visitors, and most importantly, the general vibe. So it is on these criteria that they have been rated, starting with the 10th, going all the way up to the 1st. In 10th place is St Giles in Edinburgh. St Giles is a very recognisable kind of part of the Edinburgh landscape. It has a kind of great crowned tower and this kind of very imposing kind of dark silhouette. It is beautiful inside and out, and the admission fee is voluntary as it's still a working church. Now, Edinburgh wasn't always the chief city of Scotland. It didn't become the capital until the kind of later medieval period, I believe, but the church itself was built in the 13th century. It is often called a cathedral, and I think it originally was, but it is now simply the High Kirk of the Church of Scotland, because the Church of Scotland is Presbyterian, which is a very fancy word that encompasses all sorts of theology, but the only one you really need to know about is that it means no bishops. No bishops, no cathedral. Presbyterianism was shaped kind of in part by kind of an inability or disinclination to vibe with Anglican style worship, which was often distrusted as kind of Catholicism light by some of the more hardline Protestants. And by inability or disinclination to vibe, I mean that in the 17th century, when Charles I, the second monarch of the Anglo-Scottish regnal union, tried to impose a more Anglican style of worship upon his northern subjects, a woman called Jenny Geddes allegedly yeeted a chair at the preacher. The Church of Scotland, in essence, is built different. Because of this, the church has been through a lot of changes and played many different roles. In the late medieval period, for example, monarchs worshipped there. James IV and Margaret Tudor had mass there after their wedding, and James, I think, dubbed something like 41 nights in honour of his new bride. Geddes was not even the only kind of religious firebrand stirring up trouble. John Knox, Protestant preacher and pain in my arse, occupied himself thoroughly with stirring up a ruckus in various churches, including this one. After the Reformation, part of the church was turned over as a courthouse and even a meeting place for the Scottish Parliament, while in the 17th century the church was actually divided into multiple separate churches. So the timeline of development in this building should touch on so many elements of Scottish history, whether it's political, religious or economic. It should reflect the journey that Scotland and its people have taken since the 1200s, but somehow it doesn't. There was just so little focus given to that kind of historical journey as you go around the building. Various elements are obviously highlighted. There's some stained glass windows that are talked about, and there's like a corner devoted to various writers, and there's a few information boards about kind of like figures that have been associated with the church. John Knox has a statue there, and I think there's a plaque to Gavin Douglas, but kind of The story of St Giles was notably absent, and the roles that St Giles has played in, you know, almost 8 centuries of Scottish history just wasn't there. There was no real like guidebook of sorts. The gift shop was quite like, had a few generic souvenirs and a couple of special interest books, but there was nothing to really kind of engage visitors with the historical fabric of the building. In terms of wheelchair access, like the main bulk of the building and the kind of nave was all pretty accessible for a wheelchair. There was a ramp to get in. The only inaccessible part is the Chapel of the Order of the Thistle, which was up some stairs. The Order of the Thistle is like a Scottish chivalric order, a kind of counterpart to the Order of the Garter in England and the Order of the Golden Fleece in Burgundy, and I think France has one. What's France's Order of the... This might come up in a quiz question next year, I have to know. French chivalric order. Order of the Holy Spirit, that's rubbish. Really? Okay. They did have a television on the ground floor though, kind of showing clips from the chapel. In its favour is the kind of undeniable beauty of the site and the architecture, which has clearly been like lovingly cared for over the centuries and restored where necessary. But generally I was just so disappointed in it from kind of a historical tourism perspective. It's one of the most famous religious buildings in Scotland. Its story, as I said, is that of Scotland, and it sits on one of the most famous streets in Scotland, so I just thought it was such a missed opportunity. At number 9 is the National Gallery of Scotland. The National Gallery of Scotland was not something that I had kind of high expectations for in terms of how interested I would be in all of it. I was really there to see one I was really there to see one kind of specific work of art, or kind of works of art, I guess. A triptych known as the Trinity Altarpiece. Dating from the 15th century, the Trinity Altarpiece shows James III of Scotland and his Queen Margaret of Denmark, and their son and heir James IV of Scotland as a child behind James III. King James is kind of presided over by St Andrew, and Margaret of Denmark is actually accompanied by St George. This might seem a little bit strange, as St George is now so much associated with England, but the historian Jill Harrison argues that George, quote, is depicted in such a way as to add meaning to Margaret of Denmark's piety and resonate with her position at the heart of a wider chivalric and courtly culture. I can never remember which are the outer panels and which are the inner panels, so it would have like been sat on an altar, and it was like one big main painting and then 2 wings that would shut and have paintings on the back as well as in the middle. And yeah, I can never remember which is what, but there's the 2 depicting the monarchs, and then there's one showing Edward Bonkill, who was the commissioner of the piece. I think he's sat or kneeling alongside 2 angels, and then the final panel is of the Holy Trinity with God like holding Christ, and then the Holy Spirit as a dove above them. And the centre panel that they would have closed in over has been lost, but I think I've mainly seen it theorised that it was like the Virgin Mary, or it definitely would have been a religious scene. The panels are huge. I mean, it's hard to tell because I am quite short and obviously I'm in my chair, but I would say they were a good like 5 foot tall. I'll check, because the dimensions must be online. I'll check.
I did check, and each panel is 200 centimetres tall, which is about 6.5 foot, and 100 centimetres wide, which is I think just over 3 foot. So yeah, they are large.
It's such a vibrant painting, and while not all of the images would have been painted from life, Jenny Wormold kind of theorises that Edward Bonkill's was painted from life because he looks quite... he doesn't look generic, whereas James III and Margaret of Denmark do, especially Margaret of Denmark, do look quite generic. But even though it's not been painted specifically to look like her, it is I think the only surviving image of Margaret of Denmark that we have contemporaneously to her existence. So I was very pleased to have gone and seen it. It was stunning. It was, I'd seen pictures of it. It's been my my desktop image for much of the past year, but to go and see it in the flesh, or in the wood I guess, it was lovely. And the National Gallery is free. It's right in the centre of Princes Street, so it's very easy to get to if you're kind of staying there. The National Gallery is in a wonderful building. It's kind of like a neoclassical architectural design. Getting in the building and kind of getting around access wise was pretty good. The galleries themselves were really spacious, so I could get around quite easily, except for the bathroom. The disabled bathroom was tiny. It was like this corridor. You went through this corridor that could, it was about the width of my chair. I could only just get through it, and it was kind of Y-shaped, or like wishbone shape. I don't know. I don't know about these technical terms, but you had on kind of one path, you had the disabled toilet, and then the other, I think, was like the men's toilet or something. And the bathroom itself was, it was bigger than a regular toilet, but it was tiny. Like, I could barely get in and out of my chair, and then I had to reverse the entire way out to actually leave the bathroom. So it really was not suitable. And in terms of kind of like curatorial practice, there wasn't really much like grounding detail. You didn't get the kind of full context and kind of the significance behind each of these paintings, whether that significance related to Scotland or not. So I don't know, like, I would recommend it. It's definitely something to do with an afternoon, but I would say, unless there's like either a specific work of art that you want to see, or maybe you are really interested in art history, you know, there's a reason it's 9 out of 10. At number 8 is the Surgeons' Hall Museum. It's in another wonderful building, another kind of neoclassical front. It's kind of near the university in Old Town. It's it's just south of Old College on Nicholson. Is it on Nicholson Street? I don't know if it's Nicholson Street by that point or if it's still Southbury. If you're in Edinburgh, you will know where I'm talking about. It's in Old Town, let's just leave it at that. Access wise, getting in and out of the building was pretty easy. The access wise generally around it was okay. The lift was a bit slow, and we kept getting confused about which level was which and getting out on the wrong level, but that could have been an us problem. I don't know if I can hold Surgeons' Hall Museum responsible for that. I had visited before and I enjoyed it both times. It's got a very expansive collection detailing the history of the Royal College of Surgeons and kind of other elements of medical history, specifically, or not specifically, there's like a mixed bag of stuff, but there's definitely emphasis on stuff that obviously connects to Scotland and Edinburgh. Notable topics include the work of Joseph Lister, who was kind of a Scottish Ignaz Semmelweis, and when I went this year they had a permanent exhibit, I think, on robotics in surgery, and then they had a kind of temporary exhibit about anatomical modelling. One of the best bits, I think, is they have this little like operating theatre, like a theatre in the very literal sense of the word, where it's got like the main bit and then all the tiered seats going up. I couldn't get up to the seats, they were not accessible, but I was able to kind of sit at the front, and there's like a big plastic model of a human body with like the organs exposed. And then there was like a television at the top of a video. I don't know if he was meant to be Joseph Lister or like anyone specific, but he was like giving you an anatomy lesson. And then as he's talking about it, different parts of the body were lighting up. It's definitely like, if you have kids who are like a little bit dark, a little bit macabre, I think they would enjoy it. I would say, however, that the rest of the museum, it was quite a cluttered set of exhibits. There were just so many different like implements and instruments in every cabinet that you end up kind of brushing over them rather than being able to like take them in. There was one bit where they had like 10 different things that you had to smell and guess what they were, and it was kind of herbs and flowers and stuff that had been used in medicine in the past. And when I tell you we didn't get a single one right, I think there were about 10, not a single one. And like, I know how to cook, and I love like Christmas sort of spices are my absolute favourite. Not even like mint we didn't get, but again, that's an us problem. It wasn't particularly expensive. As I said, the main exhibit was slightly cluttered and possibly a bit stale, needs a bit of a revamp, but if you are interested in medical history, then I think it's worth considering. Okay, up at number 7 is Dunfermline Abbey, sort of. So similar to the National Gallery, I was going to Dunfermline Abbey for a specific purpose, and we only looked around the exterior of the abbey. It's not really an abbey anymore, it's a parish church, but it was founded as a monastic community in the 11th century by St Margaret, Queen of Scots, whose bodily remains lay in the abbey from around her death in 1093 to around 1560, when the Reformation took Scotland by storm and saintly relics were sacked, scattered or smuggled out. Margaret's tomb, however, is still there, and it sits kind of just outside of the eastern end of the church, and we visited on a beautiful summer's day in August. I went because I had a duty to fulfill. Both my first and last postgraduate taught essays focused on St Margaret, firstly on her vita and then kind of her wider cult and veneration respectively. And I made a solemn promise that if I did well, I would of course pay my respects to what remained, albeit not the remains, of Margaret's veneration at this site. It was a pilgrimage essentially, and I do definitely feel an especial affection for St Margaret as a West Country girl who found herself enamoured of Scotland. The entire site is gorgeous. It's kind of up on a bit of a hill, so there's a beautiful view kind of down I think the south, towards the south. I don't know, do I look like Google Maps? The building itself is enormous, with these kind of gorgeous Romanesque features, which are very important to me because Romanesque architecture of this period kind of disrupts the idea that everything classically minded was just forgotten during the quote-unquote Dark Ages. Also on the site, but largely inaccessible, is the ruins of Dunfermline Palace, which was once a royal residence that enjoyed kind of extensive remodelling in the 16th century, allowing it to host the likes of James IV of Scotland and his queen, Margaret Tudor. Mary Queen of Scots stayed there, and Anne of Denmark, who was queen consort to James VI of Scotland and then James I of England. She actually gave birth to her second son and James's eventual heir, Charles, in 1600. There were some like info boards around. We had some fun with my best friend who took me. She was reading the one out about St Margaret, and we were seeing how much of it I could guess, although I already knew, because I am an insufferable know-it-all and she is a shameless enabler. I can't speak to the interior of the abbey, of course. The access information on the website is very patchy. Like, I don't actually know if or how much I could see if I went inside, but we really had come specifically for Margaret, so our visit more than fulfilled the brief. At number 6 is Salisbury Cathedral. Like the Surgeons' Hall Museum, I had already visited this site before, and like Dunfermline Abbey, it was primarily in search of St Margaret that I visited. Now, I spent huge swathes of my childhood in Salisbury and was probably more familiar with Salisbury Cathedral than any other church I'd had cause to visit. When I was a child, there was a children's trail through the cathedral called All Creatures Great and Small, and you had to look for different animals around the building. The one I can always remember is there was like in one of the tomb effigies there was a dog at his master's feet. I swear we used to do the quiz every time as well. Like, we must have left it just long enough so that me and my sister would forget all of the answers. Like, the only one I remember is that dog. They no longer have that trail, unfortunately, but they do have lots of little gems of historical significance. The oldest continuously working clock in the world, dated from around 1386, is there. There's a beautiful modern font that was installed in 2008, and of course there is the Magna Carta exhibit. Now, don't at me, but I do not see the fuss about the Magna Carta. Maybe I need to revisit their little exhibition, having studied the medieval period more in depth, but I just don't see the fuss. Like, the thing, I'm pretty sure the thing was annulled anyway after King John died, so like, who cares? But I do understand that lots of people care, and I am just not one of them. Instead, I have two favourite parts of the cathedral. The first is a diorama of the construction of the cathedral, showing kind of like it has the masons and the carpenters that are everyone who's involved in that 13th century kind of project. There is also a diorama of Old Sarum, which is the site of a now ruined castle a few miles to the north of the city. The story goes that the community at Old Sarum, which did include, I don't think there was a cathedral, I think it was just a church.
I checked and it was indeed a cathedral. A very small one, but cathedral nonetheless.
And you can like see the outlines of it now. But they were outgrowing the settlement essentially. And to decide on a new site, an archer loosed an arrow. There are two versions of what happened next. I have heard it tell that where the arrow fell was where the new cathedral would be. Now, as I just said, Old Sarum is several miles to the north of Salisbury. So unless the archer was like the love child of Katniss Everdeen and Annie Oakley, I'm not putting money on it, you know? The other version, which is maybe more realistic but kind of depressing, is that the archer hit a deer and the deer raced off, and where the poor thing died was where they decided to build their new city. My other favourite thing about Salisbury Cathedral, and the reason I wanted to visit for the upteenth time, is to see an altar in the south transept that is dedicated to none other than St Margaret, Queen of Scots.
Ariana, what are you doing here?
It was actually my mother who had spotted this. I want to say she went to like, there was like a flower show thing at the cathedral and she went to go look and she was like, is this your St Margaret? And I was thinking, no, it's St Margaret of Antioch, because it's always, like, no disrespect to St Margaret of Antioch, I understand that she did get eaten by a demon slash dragon slash lizard, but at the same time, it pure annoys me that I have to disappoint people when people are like, oh, you study St Margaret, the one with the dragon. And I'm like, no, St Margaret, whose main miracle is that a book got dropped in a river and then the book wasn't ruined. No dragons for me. Moving on, but this altar was for my St Margaret. We have not been able to kind of come up with a definitive confirmed answer as to why the altar is there. I have managed to ascertain that it was probably built in the 15th century, possibly as early as 1407, but definitely no later than 1445. The altar cloth that covers it today is seemingly unrelated. It dates from, I think, the 16th century and depicts the life of St Teresa. But I have come up with two kind of main theories as to why the altar is there. One, Margaret was a princess of the House of Wessex. Salisbury is in Wessex. And as an adolescent, Margaret spent time at Romsey Abbey and also at Wilton Abbey, which aren't too far away from the city. But this kind of theory is a little bit circumstantial for me. The other theory relates to the tomb that is next to the altar of one Bishop Mitford, who died in 1407, which is why I kind of theorised that perhaps the altar was established at the same time as the tomb was built. Mitford had a kind of specific interest in Edward the Confessor, who was Margaret's great uncle, and much of her kind of dynastic significance in Scotland and in England kind of stems from her kinship with Edward the Confessor. Am I getting sidetracked? Yes. But that altar really was the centre of this visit, and I love a very low stakes history mystery. Salisbury does remain one of the most kind of magnificent cathedrals or churches that I've visited, and even with the kind of busy city around it, the spire is visible kind of from most of the surrounding area. Sometimes when you're kind of driving into the city and you can kind of see the city kind of nestled in and then this huge spire, and it's incredible to think, like, if it's impressive now, if we can see it now, how must that have been, how must that have felt to look at it in like an era before like skyscrapers, before people mostly had kind of houses that were more than one story. The western front of the cathedral as well is just like an architectural marvel. It has over 80 specific figures, mainly of saints, but I think there's a few bishops. Is there any kings? I think there's a few kings. Not many women up there. St Margaret of Antioch is up there, but not St Margaret of Scotland. I want to say like St Ursula is, and obviously it's got like the disciples and stuff, and I think the Virgin Mary is up there like 4 times in different ways. Regardless, access wise, the main body of the cathedral is accessible and they have disabled toilets. Some of the kind of chapels on the side did have like 1 or 2 steps going in, If you're just going kind of historic tourism reasons, you wouldn't necessarily need to go into those chapels. You can see them from just outside. But if you wanted to go and have like kind of a quiet moment of prayer or reflection, then it might be that you have to do it in the nave rather than those chapels. There's a very nice cafe. There is a very mediocre gift shop, and as it is a working church, technically I think their admission fee is voluntary as well. As an aside, if you're in Salisbury and you've already visited the cathedral and you don't fancy schlepping half an hour on a bus to go and see some rocks in a field, then can I recommend St Thomas's Church. St Thomas's Church was originally a small chapel built around 1219 to kind of serve the needs of those who were involved in the building of the cathedral, from which it is about a 5-minute walk. The crowning glory of St Thomas's is this incredible medieval doom painting, as it's known, that is kind of on the wall above where I think roughly where the altar is. This painting shows Judgment Day, and it is so fucking gnarly. Like, there's zombies, there's a giant demon fish, like it's just wild. It's the sort of stuff that you don't see in kind of stained glass windows and religious art anymore. It dates from around 1470, was whitewashed over during the Reformation, and then was uncovered I think in the 1880s. St Thomas's is pretty accessible as well, you can get in, but because it's not really a tourist site, there's no cafe or gift shop or anything like that. At number 5 we have Romsey Abbey, which kind of bridges the gap between Salisbury Cathedral and St Thomas's. It's not as touristy as Salisbury Cathedral, but it's bigger than St Thomas's. And is more geared toward having visitors. At this point, it will come as no surprise to discover that the reason I visited Romsey was because of its connection to St Margaret, Queen of Scotland. Margaret's sister Christina became abbess here, and Margaret's 2 daughters, Edith, Matilda and Mary, spent part of their childhoods here. For more on that and to find out how Edith Matilda kind of championed her mother's legacy, you can check out my previous video on maternal relationships. Like Dunfermline, it's more of a parish church now than an abbey, and the cloister buildings that would have been there that would have housed the kind of female religious are no longer visible, but elements of the pre-Norman church remain incorporated into the main building. As it housed a community of nuns and had abbesses, there's a lot of women's history to be discovered there. Christina is listed as one of those abbesses, as she served in the late 11th century, but the convent enjoyed kind of the leadership of plenty of notable women. The church is, as many late medieval European churches are, dedicated to St Mary, but it's also dedicated to its patron saint and a former abbess, St Ethelfleda. She has several miracle stories attributed to her, but my favourite is that when she was reading the scriptures one evening, her candle sputtered out, but she was able to continue reading from lights which shone from the tips of her fingers. She also apparently liked to bathe naked outside in a stream at night, because everybody needs a hobby. The building's exterior is relatively plain. It's quite kind of chunky and unwieldy, but the interior is lovely, and there are several artefacts worth mentioning. There is a 15th century psalter, which is a type of religious book, on display. There is a deed of sale signed by Henry VIII, selling the church to the 4 guardians, as they became known, for £100 in 1544, and thus saving the church from the dissolution of the monasteries. There's a 10th century sculpture of the crucifixion, with Jesus attended by St Mary and St John alongside 2 Roman soldiers. There's some tombs of unknown abbesses, a few medieval wall paintings and a panel painting, and a green velvet cope, which is a type of vestment embroidered in silver gilt thread. But my favourite artefact is known as the Romsey Rose. In the 1970s, some kind of preserved organic material was discovered kind of in an alcove, and as the name suggests, people originally thought that it might be a rose, which is lovely and romantic. As it turned out, it was an onion.
O for onion and N for Niagara Falls.
And I just find that charming. Access was pretty solid throughout the building. It was very quiet and peaceful, but there were people on hand to answer questions, and overall it was a thoroughly enjoyable day out. We are now on the home stretch, and at number 4 is Edinburgh Castle. Now, as any tourist knows, sometimes the big draw in a city is just not worth it. They're always expensive, universally busy, and sometimes are just an excuse to flog mass-produced souvenirs that we in the UK like to call tat. Yet so far in my life, I have visited 2 of these heavy hitters that are absolutely worth the crowds, the effort and the ticket prices. The first is the Tower of London and the second is Edinburgh Castle. I recommend it to almost every visitor with some qualifications regarding access, which I will outline shortly. I visited Edinburgh Castle twice this year and I'd previously visited in 2016. Every single time I was swept away by the, I don't even really know how to describe it, but kind of the sheer presence. It feels like a living entity, this kind of great stone monument looking down on the city from every direction. The site has been occupied since the Iron Age. Its location on top of this kind of upthrust of volcanic rock has made it a key military stronghold. It emerged as a royal fortress in the late 11th century, but in the late 15th and early 16th century, Holyrood Palace had been built as a kind of luxurious royal palace approximately a mile to the east of the castle. That mile is of course known as the Royal Mile and is the main artery of Edinburgh's Old Town. The castle has played a role in almost every era of Scottish politics. In 1291, Edward I of England, sometimes known as the Hammer of the Scots, had various clergy swear him fealty in the small royal chapel at Edinburgh Castle, dedicated to, you guessed it, St Margaret, Queen of Scots. I'm a woman of pattern. Robert the Bruce's forces seized the castle in March of 1314. James VI of Scotland / First of England was born here in 1566, and Oliver Cromwell's troops were kind of garrisoned here in the Great Hall, and prisoners of war were kept beneath the Great Hall in the 18th and 19th centuries. Today the castle holds the 1 o'clock gun, and you can guess what time of day that artillery is fired, as well as the honours of Scotland, including a 15th century sceptre given to James IV by the Pope, a crown that may date from 1503 or earlier, though James V reworked it to its current form in 1540, and of course the Stone of Destiny. The stone is said to be the seat upon which early Pictish and Scottish kings were crowned. It has its own fascinating history. Edward I took it from Scotland and had it placed kind of in the coronation throne of the English and then British monarchs. On Christmas Day in 1950, it was infamously liberated by 4 students and delivered several months later to Arbroath Abbey. It was taken once again to England, but in 1996 was returned to Scotland and put on display at the castle on St Andrew's Day of that year. It will presumably return to England at some point in 2023 for Charles III's coronation, and there's already been kind of discussions about either revamping the exhibit in Edinburgh Castle or potentially putting together a new exhibit at Perth, which is near to the site of Scone Abbey, which is where those original coronations were said to have taken place. The honours are worth seeing in themselves. They are absolutely stunning and far less hassle to view than the British crown jewels. The exhibit is up a flight of steps, but there is a lift.
I am Jose Mourinho.
Which is very easy to get to. One of the members of staff helped me with it. All of the staff there were really friendly and happy to help. I would say that for me personally, I found about 70% of the site to be accessible. The Royal Palace and I think David's Tower is not accessible, nor is one kind of element of the Prisoners of War exhibit in Jury's Battery. Otherwise, it's mostly step-free, but there are some pretty steep thoroughfares and some very uneven ground. They do have a shuttle car service, if I recall correctly, that can kind of take you up those steeper parts of the site, so I would recommend kind of considering if you want to be driven up to the top and then slowly work your way back down. But if you are in Edinburgh and the site is suitable for you to visit, then I cannot recommend it enough. Rounding out the top 3, we have Winchester Cathedral. I have visited Winchester Cathedral before, but unsurprisingly, visiting these places with a whole 2 history degrees under my belt kind of transformed these repeat visits. Winchester isn't too far from me, and it is a really charming kind of little city that I feel like American tourists would go absolutely nuts for. The cathedral is kind of this medieval behemoth kind of dominating the landscape, though unlike Salisbury Cathedral it has no spire, and from the outside it seems a lot wider. It's, you know, a real chonk of a church, as us millennials like to say. It's a Norman era building, but it's built on the site or just adjacent to the site of the pre-Norman Old Minster, and it has hosted kind of many significant events in English history. Prince Arthur, the eldest son of Henry VII of England and his Queen Elizabeth of York, was baptised here. Henry IV married Joan of Navarre here in 1403, while Mary I married her husband, King Philip II of Spain, here in 1554, and Jane Austen is buried under the floor. In terms of its features, there is a chapel of the Holy Sepulchre with these beautiful 12th century wall paintings depicting scenes from Christ's Passion. There are 6 mortuary chests on display. These are said to contain the remains of several kings, some bishops and a queen. Confirmation of these identities is currently ongoing, but I believe there has been kind of a tentative identification of Emma of Normandy, who was the mother of Edward the Confessor. The bones of St Swithin once resided in the cathedral, and though they did not survive the Reformation, some parts of the shrine remain in place. St Swithin is not a particularly widely venerated saint. I don't know if he has any veneration or did have any outside of England, but he is best known today because there's like this belief that if it rains on his feast day that there will be 40 days of wet weather, I think. And like, I grew up in a farming family, so there was an unhealthy obsession with weather forecasts, but yeah, I don't know if kind of other people, if the youth today have heard of that little belief. It's a bit like Groundhog Day, except there's no groundhog. Or Bill Murray. There are lots of tombs in Winchester, some of them are very elaborate, various medieval bigwigs, including Cardinal Henry Beaufort, who was the half-brother of Henry IV of England, and Stephen Gardiner, who was a pro-Catholic bishop who supported Mary I and actually officiated Mary's wedding there. Now, with all these stunning medieval treasures, awe-inspiring art and magnificent architecture at my disposal, it might surprise you to hear that my favourite element of the cathedral was a thoroughly modern one, and it was the platform lift that took me from the nave up a short flight of steps to the upper level of the choir and the retro choir. I would include a video of this lift and possibly some images to kind of explain what a platform lift is. But essentially, they are a very efficient way to improve accessibility on the site with as little impact to the site as possible. They aren't universal. Some wheelchairs might not actually be suitable for some types of platform lift, so I would encourage anyone to check before going, but they are often kind of the best solution to dramatically increase the accessibility of a site, and I was just so delighted to be able to visit like almost all of it. There is a crypt below that has steps down to it, and a couple of the chapels had a step or kind of a small, what's it called, like what the fuck's it called, like a ridge, a not like a step, but you know, like the bit where you know what, let's move on. There was an exhibit which I think was also step free called, I think, Kings and Scribes, which exhibits a medieval Bible, but we visited during that cold snap a couple of weeks ago. I had a thermal vest on, I had a hot water bottle, and I had what we call my cozy toes, which is like a sleeping bag from a wheelchair, and even then I was starting to lose sensation in my extremities, so we decided we'll come back for the exhibit later. There is an admission charge to the cathedral, but it is technically a voluntary donation because it is a working church. Coming in at number 2 is Rosslyn Chapel. Now, I have a confession to make, and I don't know how unpopular this opinion is, but I sure as hell know that there are people who feel the way I do but will not admit it. I really enjoyed the Da Vinci Code. I love me some Tom Hanks, I love me some France, and I love me some wild and spurious claims about history. Throw in a mystery with clues that rest almost entirely on historical inaccuracies, and I'm there. So when my housemate at uni recommended Rosslyn Chapel, mainly on the basis of the fact that it is kind of, I would say, 90 to 95% accessible, I was sold. So one very wet Sunday afternoon, my bestie loaded me into her car and we headed south of the sea, and my friends, it was fucking lit. I loved it. Even from the outside, the building is just so idiosyncratic. Like, it's huge, but it was never actually finished, and you can tell it kind of looks as if the building is waiting for a roof or like another thing on top to finish it off. The chapel was founded as a collegiate church by a nobleman named William St Clair, and it was intended to be a chapel in a larger church, but that was never completed. Regardless, the interior is probably one of the most impressive I've ever seen. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of elaborate carvings that cover kind of every spare inch, every nook, every windowsill, every column. I've never seen anything like it. It has survived civil wars, Protestant iconoclasm, and various periods of disuse. From the 19th century, restoration and repair work has taken place, and conservation efforts have continued to the present day. There is a modern visitor centre, which is kind of key because modern visitor centres have to be built to kind of modern standards, which usually means that little old cripples like myself get to be included. Now, when you look up access information for historic sites, this is such a pet hate of mine. Very often, like 99% of the time, they begin with this kind of mostly irrelevant, just obsequious promise that they really care about disabled people and they're committed to access for all, and oh, we want everyone to enjoy our site, usually followed by a statement that, as this is a listed building, wheelchair access is limited to the front door, but we want everyone to enjoy and come along and hold hands and sing. It is just like, babes, don't patronise me. For a start, regardless of the actual accessibility of the site, I don't need this promise that you really do care about disabled access. Like, you're supposed to care about it is a legal requirement for you to care about disabled access. Just cut to the chase, because at the end of the day, whether or not the site is accessible will not be changed by how that news is delivered. But Rosslyn, oh, she ain't like other girls. First of all, the first sentence on that access tab, which is very easy to find, very often it's not easy to find, it's right at the bottom, but with this one you clicked on visit us and then accessibility was on that. It says explicitly, and I quote, Rosslyn Chapel is a 15th century building and its historic nature prevents us from making it fully accessible. Like, that's the first sentence. Just like cutting to the chase. Now, that might not be ideal, but at least I didn't have to scan through like a load of performative bullshit to actually get to the answer. How do I describe the access information that is on the Rosslyn Chapel website? They list the exact distance between the car park and the blue badge parking and the front door in meters and yards. They offer pre-booked assistance getting from the car park to the visitor centre. The width of the aisles in the gift shop is listed. They tell you that the cafe menu is going to be on a blackboard and it can be read out to you. They offer a special kind of sensory packs for children. There's an audio description of the site for visually impaired people. The hourly talk can be given in British Sign Language. It tells you the dimensions of both the disabled and non-disabled toilets. They list the type of gravel and matting surface that they use outside the building. What more could you ask for? Well, you could ask for the downstairs bit in the chapel to be accessible, but like, the point stands.
I would like to issue a formal apology for the fact that I missed the opportunity to make the joke of the point stands, which is often more than I can do. Please forgive this oversight.
It is the most comprehensive, clearly explained access information I have ever seen. I've only picked a few of these items from the site. There are a lot more. I know this is such a tangent, but wheelchair access is understandably something I really care about, something my friends and family care about, and Rosslyn was just so impressive. They have clearly and sincerely tried to mitigate the challenges of such a historic site, and I genuinely felt welcomed. As I said, knowing that they were kind of pretty forward thinking on the access was part of the appeal, and it's why my friend had recommended it. But the other draw was that Rosslyn Chapel plays a pretty significant role in none other than the Da Vinci Code. I won't spoil it, because as I said, I think it's a cracker of a film. But the entire book thing is about, quote, symbology, which I'm pretty sure, like, he must just mean semiotics, right? But Rosslyn Chapel has symbology in the hundreds. Some of the kind of carvings that I mentioned earlier, some of them include various emblems of the St Clair family. There's sculptures of flora that would have been considered exotic at that time, such as corn and I think aloe vera. There's myriad religious scenes, obviously. including the crucifixion. There's images of saints, there's images of devils, the Green Man, Lucifer, dragons, there's an angel playing bagpipes, we've got the 7 deadly sins and the 7 works of mercy. It is just this wealth of symbology that covers every inch of the interior and is testament to the incredible craftsmanship that this period enjoyed. One of my favourite pieces is a knight on horseback with another figure who is kind of riding a pillion behind him with a cross. This lady is theorised to be, of course, my good girl St Margaret, bringing the Black Rood to Scotland. We didn't know she was going to be there, so that was quite an exciting surprise. Honestly, Rosslyn could have clinched the #1 spot this year. I really am splitting hairs on this, but what kind of pushed the next exhibition to the top spot was, I think, mainly how it was marketed, or how it wasn't marketed specifically, and that is the anatomy exhibit at the National Museum of Scotland. The National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh is well worth a visit. It has Dolly the sheep, for example, and it is free. I've visited, I don't know, like, it's got to be pushing a dozen times since I first visited Edinburgh way back in 2012, and I've still not seen everything in it. It's absolutely enormous. I visited a few of their temporary exhibits. There was a beautiful display of Scottish sampler embroidery a few years ago, and quite recently there was a small exhibit on typewriters. But the exhibit I'm talking about here was a lot larger than that, in a different space in the museum, and it was called Anatomy, A Matter of Death and Life. It focused on medical research and advancements that have been drawn from the study of anatomy. It opens with some sketches made by Leonardo da Vinci, which, if I recall correctly, you know how they always have, like, obviously this is Leonardo da Vinci, blah blah blah, and then it's like on loan or with courtesy of blah blah blah, whoever owns it, and the fucking Queen owned it? Like, why has the Queen got Leonardo da Vinci sketches of feet? Anyway, it then kind of discusses at length the journey of formal anatomical study in the early modern period. Edinburgh has particular notability in this field. Doctors like Robert Liston and John Barclay, and the father, son and grandson dynasty, all called Alexandra Munro. The second half of the exhibit is quite different, however. There is a display of mort-safe coffins. A mort-safe coffin was essentially one that was securely sealed in such a way as to prevent anyone from digging up a recently deceased cadaver and carting the body off to any anatomists who were kind of willing to look the other way. It may seem inevitable then that the exhibit kind of continues by outlining the Burke and Hare murders. Burke and Hare are often called body snatchers, but they weren't. They were serial killers. They didn't steal bodies to sell to the anatomists. They murdered people and sold the fresh bodies to Robert Knox to be dissected in his lectures. It's a very famous story, and it's very much entwined with Edinburgh. Almost all of the murders took place in their lodging house in the Westport area of town, where a strip club now resides called Burke and Hare, which is very bizarre to me, but I also know of a barber's called Sweeney's, so there we are. Burke and Hare are very much part of the story of anatomy. This shortage of cadavers for medical dissection was a point of tension throughout this era, and there's the doctors' riots in New York in 1788, for example, and grave robbing, as much as murder is a part of this. But what was really interesting to me is that the exhibit is not really advertised on these grounds. There's remarkably little kind of morbid voyeurism, or as we might say, rubbernecking. The victims of these murders are kind of centred as much as possible. Unfortunately for some of the victims, there is not much information about them outside of Hare's confession. It was a very kind of quiet and sombre atmosphere. There was none of the kind of gory, true crime podcast-esque energy that you might expect from an exhibit on this subject. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. I learned a lot from it, and as I said, I did think it was done in a kind of tactful, sensitive way, I guess. I visited it twice. I visited it first some point in the spring, and then one of my best friends came to visit in summer, and she's a medical historian, so we went again. The exhibit was entirely accessible, as is the entirety of the National Museum of Scotland. Part of the museum is in a Victorian building, and then part of it is much more modern. But I think the entire thing was renovated when the modern bit was built. The only tricky part I found, the cafe is quite tight, like to move around, and the main lifts that are in the main part of the building take forever. sometimes you're better off, like, because obviously I'm in my chair so I can wheel about a fair bit, and sometimes I found it quicker to go over to the Kingdom of the Scots bit where they have the quieter lifts that are really big, that they use to like cart exhibits up and down. So sometimes I'd just sneak away and use those ones instead. So there you have it, 10 sites, exhibits, etc. that I've had the pleasure to visit this year. As I said, I was kind of surprised. 10 probably doesn't seem like a lot to other people, but I am disabled and I've had a very busy year doing my master's degree. So yeah, I was kind of surprised that it was so many. Happily surprised that I was able to go and see things both up in Edinburgh and then have seen some things down here. I've got a list of places that I would like to visit in 2023. It's tricky with disabled access, you know, having to kind of go out of your way to email people and wait to hear back, etc. Some places like Rosslyn Chapel, I would say, apart from Dunfermline Abbey, I think the disabled access information was very much workable. Obviously Rosslyn Chapel, like, but yeah, so hopefully maybe I'll make another video like this next year. Thank you very much for being with me on this journey, blah blah blah, all that kind of soppy shit. But obviously I've only been uploading YouTube videos for this autumn, and if you have been watching or commenting or liking them, then I very much appreciate that, and hopefully next year I will be able to make more. So thank you very much for watching this video. Please feel free to like and subscribe and all that kind of usual shit, and until next time.